The air in the departure lounge tasted like recycled fear and stale regret. He stood by the gate, briefcase in hand, a picture of a man on the cusp of a glorious adventure. He turned to me, his smile a practiced, flawless curve, and said, "Don't worry, darling. It's just 18 months. We'll be back before you know it, and Singapore will be our oyster." My own smile felt brittle, a mask I'd perfected over years of practice. The tears I'd shed earlier, the ones that had earned me a pat on the head and a rushed embrace, were completely artificial. They'd been my exit strategy, the final, unnecessary flourish to a goodbye that was already sealed in my heart. My life with Mark had been a slow erosion of self. We'd built a comfortable existence, filled with the hum of a well-maintained house, matching SUVs in the driveway, and the quiet hum of shared meals that rarely involved actual conversation. He was a man who thrived on order, on predictable routines, and I, it seemed, was a fixture in that routine, like the mahogany dining table or the carefully curated art on the walls. He was a successful architect, and his success was a loud, bright thing that cast long shadows over everything else. My own aspirations, my art, my desire for a life that felt more, had slowly dwindled, tucked away like outmoded furniture. He never forbade them, not directly. Instead, he'd offer gentle suggestions, observations that chipped away at my confidence. "Perhaps something a little less abstract, darling? The market for that sort of thing isn't as robust." Or, "Are you sure you want to invest that much time in a hobby when you could be planning our next holiday?" He meant well, he'd say, but his well-meaning always led me further into the quiet corners of his world, where my own voice became a whisper. I remembered the time I'd finally saved enough from selling a few small pieces to invest in a decent easel and some professional-grade oils. I'd been so excited, ready to tell him. He'd walked into the studio, looked at the new equipment, and then at me, a faint frown creasing his brow. "That's quite an expenditure, isn't it? Especially when we have the mortgage to consider. I thought we were saving for that trip to Tuscany." He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't forbidden me from using it. He just made the desire feel irresponsible. Guilt, a familiar companion, settled in my chest, and the easel remained largely unused for months. Then there was the incident with my sister, Sarah. She'd been going through a difficult divorce, and I'd offered to help with her legal fees. I'd carefully explained my plan to Mark, how I'd liquidate some of my less significant investments to free up the funds. His reaction was swift, though cloaked in concern. "Darling, are you sure this is wise? Sarah has a tendency to not always manage finances responsibly. What if she asks for more? What if it jeopardizes our own financial security?" He'd then spent the next week subtly highlighting our own savings goals, the upcoming renovations, the need for a healthy rainy day fund. Sarah eventually found the help she needed elsewhere, and I felt a prickle of shame for even considering overextending us. He'd made my generosity feel like recklessness. He had a talent for framing his self-interest as prudent care, his control as loving protection. The day he left for Singapore was the culmination of a plan I'd been meticulously constructing for nearly a year. It had started small, a growing unease that solidified into a cold certainty. I saw the way he looked at me, the way he'd begun to refer to me as his accomplishment, a well-maintained asset. He was already planning his life without me, or rather, his life with me as a distant, decorative accessory. The Singapore job, a plum assignment that would set him up for a promotion upon his return, had been his obsession for months. He'd spoken of it with such fervent anticipation, envisioning himself as the savior of a faltering project, the visionary architect in an exotic locale. I'd listened, nodded, and felt a growing detachment, a quiet resolve hardening within me. While he packed his tailored suits and his favorite cufflinks, I was busy. I made appointments. I opened new bank accounts. I meticulously scanned and saved every financial document in the house. He was so caught up in his grand narrative that he never saw the quiet unraveling happening in our shared home. The actual departure was anticlimactic, almost mundane, which, in a twisted way, made it feel even more profound. The airport was a sterile, impersonal space. He was buzzing with nervous energy, checking his watch, his phone, already mentally in Singapore. When he pulled me in for that perfunctory hug, the one that felt like a goodbye to a piece of furniture, I let the tears come. I'd practiced the trembling lip, the watery eyes in the mirror. It was a performance for an audience of one, but it felt essential. He'd looked at me, a flick. Curve something, concern? Annoyance? Crossing his face. There, darling. It's only 18 months. You'll be fine. Just keep things ticking over here. His words were laced with the assumption of my utter dependence, my inability to cope without his guiding hand. He saw my tears not as a reflection of my pain, but as his own burden, a sign of his own importance. He squeezed my shoulder, a patronizing gesture, and then he was gone, swallowed by the throng of travelers heading for new horizons. I watched him walk away, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. The oyster, I knew, was mine to shuck. The first few weeks were a blur of activity, masked by a veneer of normalcy. I went through the motions of our routine, answering calls from well-meaning friends and family who asked about Mark's trip, offering assurances that I was managing. But behind the closed doors of our home, a different kind of life was unfolding. I was systematically dismantling the financial edifice he had built, and more importantly, he had taken for granted. I accessed our joint accounts, the ones he assumed I'd only ever touch for household expenses. Then, with a surgical precision honed by months of study and calculation, I began to transfer funds. Not in one go, not in a way that would trigger immediate alarms. Small, steady transfers, meticulously routed through intermediary accounts, disguised as investments, payments, anything that looked remotely legitimate. I liquidated stocks, sold bonds, cashed out investments he'd made years ago and forgotten about. The $812,000 was a formidable sum, an amount he considered his own private reserve, the ultimate safety net for his ambitions. But it was also, in large part, marital property, accumulated during our years together. And he had, in his arrogance, left me with the keys. I changed the locks on our house the day after he left. It was a small act, but it felt significant. It was the first tangible barrier I erected, a physical manifestation of the separation that had already occurred in my mind. I canceled the joint credit cards, leaving him with only the supplementary ones he used for his travel, useless without access to the primary accounts. I informed our bank of my intentions, presented them with photocopies of prenuptial agreements I'd discovered tucked away in his office filing cabinet, agreements that, while protecting his premarital assets, were vague on the division of assets acquired during our marriage, especially in the event of abandonment. I knew his game. He'd assumed I'd be waiting, pining, reliant on him. He'd underestimated my capacity for quiet rebellion, my understanding of his own meticulous nature. He believed in control, in systems, and I had simply repurposed his own tools against him. The first crack in his carefully constructed world appeared about a month later. I received a frantic text message. My card has been declined for the hotel bill. What is going on? And the travel allowance hasn't cleared. Sort this out immediately. I didn't reply. A few days later, an email landed in my inbox, this one more formal, laced with his familiar impatience. I've had to use a significant amount from my personal contingency fund. This is unacceptable. I need access to our accounts. This entire situation is becoming an inconvenience, and frankly, I don't have time for this. I let it sit, a digital monument to his dawning realization. Then, the flying monkeys began. His mother called, her voice laced with manufactured concern. Darling, Mark's a bit distressed. He mentioned some financial discrepancies. Is everything all right? Is he being difficult? I offered polite, vague reassurances, implying that perhaps his stress overseas was causing him to misinterpret things. His sister, ever the loyal lieutenant, followed suit. Mark's really struggling to get things sorted there. He said something about you not being very communicative. Is there something going on between you two? I maintained my composure, my voice calm, measured. I was the wronged wife, the one left behind, enduring his absence. I wasn't the one who had orchestrated his financial isolation. The true shift, the moment his smug certainty shattered, came when he finally managed to get a hold of me via a convoluted conference call arranged by his exasperated HR department. He sounded different then. The bravado was gone, replaced by a raw edge of panic. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice tight. "The primary accounts are frozen. My cards are useless. I can't access anything. They say there's been a significant withdrawal and redirection of funds. They're asking for clarification." I listened, my heart a steady, unwavering drumbeat in my chest. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't threatened. I had simply executed my plan. I opened a new document on my laptop, the clean white screen mirroring the emptiness I now felt for him. I began to type, slowly, deliberately. "Mark, I said, my voice devoid of emotion, I've taken steps to secure my own financial future. You were so focused on your 18-month adventure, you failed to consider the implications for the life you were leaving behind. I've made arrangements for my independent security. The funds transferred are a reflection of that." I paused, letting the silence stretch. Then, I continued, the words crisp and final. "According to our prenuptial agreement, Section 4, subsection C, in the event of prolonged absence and failure to maintain joint financial oversight, the custodial spouse reserves the right to unilateral reallocation of marital assets for personal security and future stability. I've consulted with legal counsel. Everything is in order. You'll be receiving divorce papers shortly, along with a detailed accounting of the settlement." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could almost see his face, the color draining from it, the arrogant confidence collapsing into a gaping maw of disbelief and fury. He sputtered, he raged, he threatened lawyers and ruin, but his words were hollow echoes against the solid wall of my resolve. He was trapped, a king without a kingdom, a planner whose grand design had been undone by the quiet machinations of the person he'd dismissed as a mere fixture. The aftermath was predictable, a tempest of indignation and recrimination. His mother wailed about social ruin, his sister sputtered about betrayal. Text messages flooded my phone, a torrent of accusations and appeals from his side of the family. Mark, in Singapore, was in a state of shock, his calls growing more desperate, then eventually less frequent as his options dwindled. He had no access to funds. His career trajectory in Singapore was abruptly halted by the ensuing financial scandal and the impending divorce proceedings. The company recalled him, not with accolades, but with suspicion. He was a pariah, a man who had vanished financially, leaving a trail of bewildered colleagues and a wife who had simply moved on. There were no more performances for me, no more faked tears. Just a quiet, undeniable finality. He had sought an adventure, and in his pursuit, he had inadvertently handed me the tools to build my own. The $812,000, once his perceived safety net, had become the foundation of my new beginning. The silence that followed his frantic calls was not emptiness, but a vast, open space where I could finally hear my own voice, clear and strong, unburdened by the weight of his expectations.